Okay, I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the founders, along with Carla Cohen, of Politics and Prose. And I don't have a physical therapist, but I have an exercise therapist. And about 3 weeks ago, my exercise therapist gave me a copy of Run, Don't Walk. And she didn't give it to me, she lent it to me, and said, please read this. I think you'll find it very, very interesting. And which I did immediately. And then I ran, not walked, to Politics and Prose to sign up to introduce the author when she came. And so today is the day that she is here. Adele Levine received her master's degree and doctorate in physical therapy from the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and then worked in Walter Reed rehabilitating soldiers who have lost limbs in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Walter Reed is not only America's largest military hospital, but it also has the world's leading military hospital. It also is the world's leading hospital in treating amputees. I thought that Adele had just the right mix of compassion and humor about the long, hard days that she spent with the veterans in her care. She shared her vulnerability, which allowed her tremendous empathy with those that she was asking so much of. Her greatest survival tool, she'll tell you, is her sense of humor, which is why I found her painful story also a delight to read. Adele has written some 30 pieces of humor for the Washington Post, and when she's not working, she's also a long-distance swimmer, having swum across the Chesapeake Bay 6 times. But today she's going to be talking. So here's Adele to talk about her book, Run, Don't Walk. Adele.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. And I am grateful to Politics and Prose for having me here today. I'm going to talk a little bit just about how it happened that I wrote a book, and because I'm sure many of my friends are sort of still in disbelief that this happened, and also why I decided to write this book. So in 2007, I owned a 17-year-old car that my friends nicknamed the Rustang because the doors had rusted shut, and the only way you could get in or out of my car was to actually climb in through the window. But I love that car, and in spite of the fact that I had to use a screwdriver to unlock my seatbelt, I was never going to stop driving my car, except that one day I was driving home, and I was going down Georgia Avenue, and I was about a half mile from my apartment, and my car just all of a sudden just caught on fire. And I didn't know what to do, so I just quickly rolled my window down, and I unlocked my seatbelt, and then I just kept driving my car. And I managed to get it home, and I whipped it into the parking lot behind my building, and I jumped out of the car, and then after that day, my car just never drove again. And I felt terrible about it, and I just didn't have the heart to call a tow truck and had them come and drive my poor car away, so I just kept it out back where it just sort of rusted away. And then one day I was at home and I was reading the Washington Post, and they had this article about local eyesores. Yeah, and at the end of the article there was a query. Do you know of an eyesore? If you do, let us know and we'll send a reporter out to write about it. And then I thought, well, yeah, I know an eyesore, and it's parked out back. So I thought, well, I'm not going to bother the Washington Post reporters with my tragic car story, so I just thought I'll write it up myself. So I wrote it up, and then I sent it into the Post, and then I went out with some friends. And when I got home that night, there was a message on my machine from the editor, and he said that he loved my story. And he said if I had anything else I ever wanted to send in, just to go ahead and send it in. And then he added at the end, especially if it was about Metro. So I guess he figured, here is a person who's definitely taking the bus. So for the next 3 years, whenever something funny would happen to me, I would write it up and I would send it to the Washington Post. And I was really lucky. I was lucky for a couple reasons. One is I was lucky because it got my feet wet. Believe me, this book never would have happened. I never would have written this book if my car hadn't caught on fire on Georgia Avenue. But mostly I was lucky because during those 3 years, it really gave me an outlet. Because at that time, things at Walter Reed started to get really hot. I worked as a physical therapist in the amputee section. And at first, we mostly saw single leg amputees and patients who'd lost their legs below the knees. But as the wars went on, the injuries steadily got worse and worse. We went from seeing single leg amputees to mostly patients who were double and triple amputees, meaning they had lost two legs and an arm. We watched the amputations move up the body. So they went from being below the knees and below the elbow to above the knees at the thighs, above the elbow. We saw patients who started to lose their legs at the groin, and we even began to see patients with partial pelvic amputations. By the time Walter Reed closed in 2011, almost all of our new patients were either double or triple amputees, and we had rehabilitated 3 men who had lost all 4 of their limbs. But I was lucky because I had a hobby after work that forced me to sort of look for the funny side of life. And all of my coworkers who made it through those years at Walter Reed had some sort of outlet, whether it was baking cakes or training for 100-mile running races, or even attain keeping up with the highly complicated world of celebrity news. And all of us shared a very dark sense of humor. You could go to the biggest trauma center in the country, and you might see 1 amputee. At Walter Reed, we regularly rehabilitated 100 to 150 amputees a day. And we did it all inside a glassed-in rehab clinic, which was glassed in so they could lead tour groups around the perimeter. And they led tour groups all day long, so you're always looking out the glass at people looking in at you. And my coworkers and our patients used to say, oh, this is how it must feel like to be an animal at the zoo. Don't feed the animals. But I always felt like, to me, it felt like just a really kind of dark sitcom because, the tour groups always looked horrified, but then on the other side of the glass, on our side of the glass, we were always joking and laughing. And the patients especially, they would make fun of each other. They would call each other names like Ugly Stump or Princess if someone was having a hard day. And they wore T-shirts that said things like, I had a blast in Afghanistan and Marine 40% off. And, the staff, we weren't much better. We were always consumed with whatever junk we'd seen on late night TV, including ordering a Snuggie for the clinic. But the overall feel in there was that this was normal, this was life, and we were all going to move through it together. This is the longest war our country has ever been in. And as my coworker Attain puts it, this is our generation's war. But it affects so few people. And on a personal level, I remember how completely astounded I was the day I got a patient who had lost both of his legs after doing 6 deployments. When Walter Reed began to shut down in 2010, it coincided with the surge in Afghanistan. And that year, the caseload at Walter Reed tripled. Unfortunately, Walter Reed was also in the process of moving to Bethesda. And the first thing that happened was that they started to shut down the employee parking lots. So in order to find parking, you had to get to work no later than 6 in the morning, which we all did. We got to work at 6. We worked through lunch, and we stayed late. And we were so busy that at night in my dreams, everyone was an amputee, even me. Now, I know my friends over the years have gotten really sick of hearing me say that I was going to quit Walter Reed. I was always going to quit. I was going to leave. This was it. I was done. I was going to find a job with parking and better hours. But then the next time they saw me, I was still at Walter Reed, and they would get, irritated. But I never could quite explain it. And, the reason I ended up staying, and I stayed for 9 years, was because I was part of something that was much larger than myself, and I couldn't just walk away because it was hard. And I was lucky because at night I was busy trying to find something funny to write about, to send to the Post and hopefully have them publish it. And that really took my mind off of, what I was seeing at work. And then one day, my partner Ashley surprised me and said something to me that really blew me away. She said, you're wasting your time writing those stories for the Post. And I was shocked. She said that she thought my articles, they're cute and they're funny, but, you're missing the real story. And she said I should be writing about Walter Reed. And I thought, that's a crazy idea. That's completely insane. The whole reason I'm writing in the first place is to get my mind off of work. The last thing I'm ever going to do when I get home from work is write about work. And then like a week later, it was almost as if, they'd kind of planned it. The editor that I had worked with at the Post called me, and he said he thought, with Walter Reed shutting down, it would be really interesting if I were to write a few articles about my job. And I said pretty much the same thing to him, but probably in a nicer way. I said, no way. I said that I just didn't feel comfortable doing that. So the next day my phone rang, and it was a reporter from the Post. And he said that he was going to be writing an article about the clinic I worked in. And boy, I tell you, I was so mad when I heard that. I was just seething on the phone. And he was asking me questions, and I was just getting angrier and angrier. And I could tell that, he just didn't get it. And how could he? He didn't work in our clinic. He seemed to be hunting for what I felt like was a really grotesque, shocking story, about the most horrifyingly mutilated patient in there. And he was just seeing the devastation. And in spite of all the devastation that we really did see at Walter Reed, it wasn't a depressing place at all. It was a happy place where we celebrated life. And in fact, our colonel there always referred to our clinic as the happy place. And she was right. It was a happy place. And so I decided that I was going to write the article, and I wrote it. And I wrote what I felt was like a pretty innocuous article. I wrote about taking some of our patients swimming for the first time. And I didn't think this was a really fantastic article, and I had deliberately kept it pretty mild. So I was really surprised by the reaction that it got. People called me, people emailed me, and one day at work, this elderly woman stopped me in the hospital, and she asked if I was Adele Levine. And she was probably in her 80s, and she handed me this envelope, and then she walked away. And when I opened the envelope, there was a letter from her, and she said that she was a retired Army physical therapist. And when she had read my article in the Post, she knew she had to come to the hospital and hand deliver it so that I would know how much it meant to her to read about it. And when I read her letter, I realized at that moment that Ashley was right, that this was a story that people wanted to hear, and also that I was the right one to do it, that I would be able to write about Walter Reed in a humane and humorous way with the insight that maybe an outside writer would not have. So Walter Reed shut down, and I was part of the group that transferred to the new Walter Reed at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and I wrote the book. And before I turned the manuscript into my publisher, I kind of ran it up the chain of command. I had some of my coworkers read it and my supervisors, and then I had to give it to the department head. And this is a guy whose management style and he's not here, I would, I would classify as being like highly unpredictable and slightly insane. And I was really nervous about giving it to him. I thought he's going to blow his top. So I thought, well, I'll wait till Friday and I'll give it to him at the end of the day, and that way he'll have the weekend to, hopefully cool off. So Friday came, and he shows up at work, and I gave it to him, and I just took a step back because who knows how he's going to react. And instead he got really sentimental. And he said that we had this, this new hospital and this nice facility, and that most of the staff had stayed on. But he always felt like there was something missing, and he couldn't put his finger on it, exactly what it was. And then one day he realized what it was, and he said it was a spirit. He said it was a ghost that you could actually feel when you were at the old Walter Reed. And I think my coworkers who are here can attest to that there was a feeling there. And there had to be. 150,000 people were treated at Walter Reed, and it was the oldest military hospital in America. And it is exactly 2.8 miles from here. Frequently I thought about maybe coming here on my lunch break, but I just never had a lunch break. But if you do drive past it, it's catty corner from Rock Creek Park. And if you drive past it, before they knock it down and turn it into a supermarket and new condominiums, I hope you think about that spirit. And I hope that you enjoy the book. And the selection I'm going to read is the article that I wrote first for the Washington Post about taking our patients swimming for the first time. I revised it and expanded it, and it later turned into this book. And I also want to say that I've been coming to Politics and Prose since 1994, and I love this bookstore, and I actually wrote large parts of my book downstairs at that big table. So, okay. When you lose a leg or two, it's hard to exercise. You gain a belly and sometimes a lot more, especially at Walter Reed, where we were surrounded by trays and trays of homemade chocolate chip cookies. Thanks to the generosity of the administration and local athletes, our patients were constantly being introduced to unusual sporting events that they couldn't do, like rock climbing. The centerpiece of our clinic was our larger-than-life climbing wall. It was 2 stories tall, and whenever there was a news feature about the amputee clinic, the cameras always zoomed in on that climbing wall. It was easily the most photographed piece of equipment in the entire hospital. Yet weeks, sometimes months, would go by without a single patient ever climbing it. When new patients saw the climbing wall, their eyes lit up and they got immediately excited. I knew what they were thinking. Hey, losing 2 legs must not be that bad if I'm going to be able to climb this wall. I'm going to get new legs, and I'm going to climb this and do everything just like I did before. I was guilty of facilitating this kind of deception. The climbing wall was the very first thing I showed new patients to. I did it because it cheered them up, and it was a lure, a way to get them to buy into physical therapy. But for all its usefulness in rehab, it might as well have been an ice skating rink. Pigeon was frequently limited by his prosthetic leg. His amputation was so high up on his thigh it was hard to get a good socket fit. The socket frequently slipped off his stump, and sometimes it rotated on him when he walked. But swimming was something I thought he could do, since it mostly involved floating, and you didn't have to worry about falling. In the pool, you don't need fancy equipment. You don't need special water. You don't even need prosthetics. Just goggles and some bravado. Outside of work, I'd begun training again with a recreational swim team a few nights a week. We practiced at a community pool close to Walter Reed. One day I called and asked the pool manager if it would be okay if we brought some of the patients. I thought he'd say no, or at the very least charge us, but he said that it would be fine and that it would be free. So the next week we borrowed a van from Disabled Sports USA and drove 5 guys to the pool. I'm no swim coach and have no idea how to teach anyone to swim. But I'm a physical therapist, which in the patient's eyes puts me on the same level as Genghis Khan. So when I suggested everyone get out of their wheelchairs and into the pool, no one argued with me. It was shallow, only 4 feet deep, so if you had a leg, you didn't necessarily have to be able to swim. But for the others, the ones who had no legs at all, my only strategy was for them to cling to the wall and venture across the pool in any way they saw fit. We learned some surprising things. It is impossible for a person who is missing both legs to sink. You can do backflips off the side of the pool using just your arms to spring you into the air. And even if you are a triple amputee missing both legs and an arm, you can pull yourself easily and gracefully a half dozen times back and forth across the pool with your one good arm. I figured the pool program would gradually lose its appeal, but the next week when we brought the van around, 8 patients waited, along with Pigeon, and then 11. I consulted with the coach from my swim team, and she volunteered her services. She didn't have a car, but took 2 trains and a bus to meet us in the middle of the day. She was a strict and serious coach. Pigeon would hang on the side of the pool, his injuries submerged under the water, listening seriously to our feedback, before pushing off to swim another lap under her guidance. The soldiers learned modified flip turns and racing starts. They did drills and races and worked up to 500 and then to 2,000 yards of continuous swimming. Having a coach gave some legitimacy to our program, and for 2 hours once a week, the soldiers stopped being patients and were transformed into a swim team of sorts. We were still a motley crew at the pool. I was convinced our time there was limited. In addition to their obvious battle injuries, most of the patients had big, semi-offensive tattoos. They were loud and boisterous and left their prosthetic legs and arms lying around the pool deck. And in between sets, they'd splash and dunk one another under the water and generally create inappropriate pool chaos. But no one ever got mad at us. Instead, a strange thing began to happen. People started to swim with us. They'd get out of their lane and hop in ours. "Man," they would say, swimming up to the nearest soldier, "you are doing a good job. You keep on swimming. You can do this." One day we got to the recreation center and the elevator going down to the pool was broken. I thought that some of the guys could bump down the stairs on their behinds, but it was 2 flights. Would they have enough energy to lift themselves back up the stairs later? We were getting ready to leave when the pool manager and 2 of the lifeguards came running up and wordlessly began carrying our most injured guys down the stairs. It happened so fast I didn't get a chance to second guess it. An hour later, when we got out of the pool, they were standing at the stairs waiting for us. I had seen a lot of goodwill in my years at Walter Reed, but nothing on this level. Physically reaching out and carrying another person. And in my world of heroes and superheroes, I put those lifeguards up there with firefighters and ambulance drivers. So, thanks for coming here. So,
Okay, we've just got one mic today, but it's over here. Got a question? Here comes the question.
yeah.
Sounds like you all do great work. How does the therapist and the operations at Walter Reed approach religious and spiritual questions from the patients?
Oh, we have a chaplain who's in our clinic
Okay.
who handles most of those questions. I guess
You take care of the physical, he takes care of the spiritual.
that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Humor is your spirit.
Yeah. We're only interested in making you work. So, yeah. Okay.
Did you show the book to many of the actual soldiers that you had been treating, and what did they think about it?
I didn't, but I was surprised that a lot of them ordered it and read it, and they seemed to like it. I was surprised because I thought, oh, they're not going to be interested in what one of the PTs is doing, you know. But I guess they are kind of interested in what we do when we're not giving them a hard time. So, but they've been very supportive. Yeah. So,
What's next for you?
do I still? Do I still keep in touch with them? Yes, on Facebook, where everybody keeps in touch. Yeah. I'm meeting one of them tomorrow, actually, with my friend and therapist, Attain. So.
There's a relatively notorious guy who lost both legs in an accident on Mount Washington, where he was caught in an ice cave and caused the death of one rescuer and so on. But he's gone on to try to redeem himself by developing very advanced prostheses at least for below-the-knee amputees that allow them to climb walls. And I wondered whether you ever ran into people who were able to use his prostheses to climb this infamous climbing wall.
Oh.
I've forgotten what his name is, but he's at MIT.
We did have an amputee come visit us who was a bilateral below-the-knee amputee.
Bilateral below-the-knee, yeah.
But we had so many amputees come visit us. And we have access to all the latest and greatest prosthetics. But I have to say that it's really the work you put into it. You can have, and the nice thing about having, I know for climbers that the smaller your foot is, the better you can fit it into little cracks. So one of the advantages, I guess, of being an amputee is that you could get a really small foot. But there's a big world of difference between being a below-knee amputee and being an above-knee amputee. Most below-knee amputees can pretty much get back to everything they were doing before their injury with some modification. They might walk a little funny going up a hill just because their ankle doesn't bend that much. But otherwise they can run, they can ride a bike, they can swim, they can mountain climb. It definitely becomes a little more difficult when you are missing both legs below the knees. But again, missing your legs below the knees versus missing your legs above the knee, it's such a different world. So, but I do think I remember him coming to visit.
What was the purpose of the amputee tourism, which I personally find really
What was the question was, what was the purpose of the amputee tourism? I don't know. I just think that we were under the spotlight quite a bit at Walter Reed. And we were in a smaller clinic before, and we used to have a lot of visitors, like USO visitors and celebrities and media that would come in, and they would come into our room, and it was just so crowded in there to begin with. So I don't think they started out to build it for us to be under the spotlight like that. I think they really wanted to do that to give us our space, but to still allow visitors to come. But then it did sort of start to become amputee tourism. I like that term. So.
What advice would you have for writers? There's obviously a lot of humor and realness to your prose, but how would you describe your approach?
Oh, the question is, what's your advice for writers? My advice is to get a coffee maker with a timer on it. Seriously, get up at 5 and write every day, because for me, I just found it became easier when I got sort of into the habit. And also, what else are you going to do that early in the morning? You're not going to post any status on Facebook, hey, 5 a.m., but so that's just my opinion. Just get up every day, and I'd run for the coffee maker. So.
You mentioned a moment ago the advances in prosthetics. You must have seen quite a few over the 9 years that you were doing this. Can you talk a little more about that and what more you think needs to be done to improve them?
Yeah. I think it's really interesting that most of the advances in prosthetics have been with the knee. And the knee is just a hinge joint. So it's the simplest prosthetic out there. But if you don't have your knee, you're in a world of trouble as far as walking. But the arm prosthetics are still fairly Civil War era. Even though you see it on the news all the time, they're always showing some mind-body connection or some myotome hand that can respond to your thoughts or actions. But they're in reality, they're not very functional. And most people I know who have those don't use them because they're heavy. And again, nothing can really replace your hand. At Walter Reed, we started all of our new above-the-knee amputees on a prosthetic knee that was called the C-leg, which was the first computerized microprocessor knee. And then the C leg has had many advances. Now there's the X2. Well, there was the Genium, then the X2, and now there's the X3. But before, if you're using a mechanical knee to walk, you'd have to really throw your leg out there to make sure that the knee was straight and locked out before you put your weight through it, because if it wasn't, it was going to give way underneath you and you would go down. And the same thing would happen maybe if you took a step backwards or if you stepped on a rock or went downhill. If you weren't constantly focusing on where your foot was and where the knee was in your walking cycle, it would just suddenly give way underneath you. Well, the C leg changed all that, because when a patient puts about 70% of their body weight on the toe of their leg, here, the knee will release and it will step forward, and then it will lock up again. So it's a very safe knee. It's very stable, and it takes a lot of that constant thinking about what your knee is doing out of the equation. Like, you can see patients when they're new walkers, when they're walking and you talk to them, they'll stop in order to answer your questions or to continue the conversation because they're thinking so much. But as they become better, they're able to walk and talk at the same time, which is something that we don't really ever think about, you know. And I think with the development of the microprocessor knees, that's really helped, because they don't have to worry all the time, is their knee just suddenly going to give way underneath them. And remember, you can't feel the floor under your foot. So it's a lot of strength and control that's going on. And if you are a bilateral amputee, you're doing that twice as much. So I think the advances have been really good with that. They're also working on powered prosthetics, but I have to say that I find that those are really much more gimmicky and heavy and more of a moneymaker, I would think. I hope there are no prosthetists here. So.
Did TBIs ever go along with the amputations too because of the blast injury?
Oh yeah, everyone had a TBI. I mean, everyone, you know, it was pretty mild, but enough that in the beginning things weren't, you know, patients were a little more irritable. They were irritable to begin with, but maybe they were more irritable and had more trouble with sequencing. Yeah.
That was sort of something I was going to ask. I know your world is physical therapy and, you know, working with amputees, but Walter Reed also works with traumatic brain injury. Is there any crossover in the approach you would take for treating both types of patients?
Well, we worked as a big team at Walter Reed, so the TBI therapists were in the clinic too, and we did some of our patients would go through, if they had a bad traumatic brain injury, they would go to a rehab facility first. I mean, they would be sort of stabilized and healed up first at Walter Reed, and then they would go to a specialized TBI center, and then they would come back to do their amputee rehab. So.
You mentioned that some of the amputees, 3 of them you said, had part of the pelvis missing. Was there a prosthetic developed to help them, and how did it work?
Yeah, they have a prosthetic that's kind of like a padded bucket that they would sit in, you know. I mean, it depended if it was both parts of their pelvis or if they're missing both of their legs at the hips. I mean, obviously, walking is going to be so much, it's going to consume so much energy for them that it's just not that practical for them to be walking around all day. But we did, you know, a lot of them wanted to try, and so we would try it out. And also, we would have special wheelchair cushions for them that were kind of molded to them. So
Essentially, they're wheelchair bound most of the time.
yeah.
And what are you doing now?
I work for myself now. So, but if anyone wants to hire me, I'm available. So, yeah. Oh, you could just.
Not sure quite know how to verbalize this, but I'm military spouse, and particularly living where we live, there is this like disconnect where my husband was in a in the Pentagon on 9/11, and we lost a lot of friends, and we've gone, we're that small part of the world that actually has been affected. And I'm wondering if you were ever in the spot that I frankly find ourselves in a lot, which is assumptions about the type of people who join and fight or are in the military. There's a lot of assumptions about who they are and their political views, versus what you were finding at Walter Reed, if you ever were in like an odd position that way.
Oh, totally.
Yeah, 'cause
My-
my husband's at the
I-
Pentagon, and so they'd be like, ooh, he works at the Pentagon, he must love Bush. And I'd be like, no.
Yeah.
You know, like, so I was just wondering if that happened to you a lot.
Oh, definitely. I,
Happens to me.
I think that maybe I was sometimes viewed as a traitor or whatever. I don't know. I mean, I know my partner Ashley's family is very liberal and extremely liberal, and I think that for a long time they viewed me as some conservative Republican. And also, I was asked, you know, well, do you treat Iraqis or people from Afghanistan there? And I was like, well, no, because we're in America and this is an American military hospital. But that was, I mean, yeah, sometimes I felt that. But I just always felt like, you know, politics just doesn't have a role in rehab, you know, because, you know, we're all people, we're all good people. And I mean, sometimes we would have some good-natured teasing, I guess, in the clinic between, you know, some of my patients who are definitely much more conservative than I was, and they knew it, and I knew it, and so we would make fun of each other during elections. But, you know, I think it opened my eyes up to, you know, different kinds of people. And I also thought it was very interesting because at Walter Reed, we were, and you know, because being at the Pentagon, you're surrounded by people from all walks of life and people from all over America and also all over the world. And, you know, you would think, you know, by watching the news that you wouldn't get along, but actually you do. And I think having those differences is really important because, you know, instead of letting our politics get in the way, you know, we all sort of pulled together to tackle the problem. So, and I wonder if we were really homogeneous, if that would have happened. No. So, it's a good question. It's actually in, like, there's I had to fill out this, like, reading group, something for reading groups, and that was one of the questions they asked, you know. But I was much more political before I worked at Walter Reed, and now I just don't watch the news that much. I'm a big dummy, I guess, when it comes to that.
Adele, I have a question. The spirit that your superior identified in as being present at Walter Reed in the old hospital,
Yeah.
when you got to the new hospital, did that change?
Yeah, I feel like it changed quite a bit. But the new hospital has such a different feel. Even when you look at it, it's very sterile and modern looking. And the old hospital just had this comfortable feeling to it. It just felt homey. You know, it had these 100-year-old brick buildings with multi-paned glass. And when you'd walk up the stairs at the old hospital, they were stone steps, but they were worn in the middle, so they seemed like they sagged. And I always just loved that because I thought of how many people have been walking up and down these stairs, you know, before me. And unfortunately, it won't be after me. But there was a feeling there, and there was also a lot of pride, and it was a different feel. So, yes, Cheryl.
I'm wondering, especially when you went through school, like, was there anything that in school that prepared you to the extent of what you would see? Because it seems like what happened to these soldiers hasn't been seen in such a long time, and I wonder if schools and the academic programs just don't prepare.
Oh. Yeah, so the question is, was I prepared for what I was going to see? And the answer is no. I was in no way prepared. And I had no idea what I was doing when I walked in. I was completely floored. And I remember the first patient I saw who was combat injured and how completely blown away I was when I saw him. And I remember it was a physical reaction. I remember feeling my heart sort of speed up. And I couldn't understand why I was feeling that way, because I had seen bad injuries before in school. They would trot us through shock trauma and see who would faint. But I think it was because it was the first time I'd seen anyone who was maliciously and deliberately hurt. But so I wasn't prepared. But I have to say, I worked with a great team of people, and everybody pitched in, and everybody helped each other out. And there was a lot of education. And nobody's ever seen injuries like this before. You know, we sent our soldiers and our Marines, our ground troops, off to battle, this time carrying their own tourniquets, you know. And the combat medics carried powder and cauterizing bandages so that they could stop the blood flow immediately. And so they were able to save so many lives that normally never would have been saved. So we saw injuries that people would have very easily died from just 10 years prior. So the injuries, you know, they got worse and worse because the medical care got better and better, you know, and probably also the bombs got more extreme, but nothing could prepare you for that. But luckily we worked as a team. So.
I'm very interested at your comments about Walter Reed, because I won't claim I read everything about it, but the articles I did read were extremely negative. They were about the scandal of the conditions in some of the wards and all. Do you think that, in fact, this facility should have been retained and itself rehabilitated?
Oh, of course I think it should have been retained. And as far as the scandal, they were talking about a building that wasn't on base. It was off base. It was across the street. It was outside the gates. I never saw it myself, so I can't attest to the conditions. But, you know, we were working, the original hospital, which was 102 years old, was in use as an administrative place. So, but the newer hospital was built in 1977. That's where we worked. My house was built in 1943, and I hope that nobody's going to come and knock it down because it's so, you know, old. You know, my mother's from Switzerland, where they have buildings that are 1,000 years old and still in function. So I just think, you know, now you have just a big bureaucracy. I think things work better when they're a little smaller. That's just my opinion. And again, I'm not in administration, but I know that I was sad to see it close, and I think I speak for most of my coworkers. We were all sad.
Well, particularly when you hear now about the shortage of facilities for the veterans and all, it does seem not terribly good decision.
Oh. Well, again, the veterans hospitals are different because they're not active duty. We are an active duty military facility. So
yeah, I see.
Yeah.
Did you ever have any qualms? I'm sorry, I should, but about the resuscitation of people who were so gravely injured?
I mean, I felt bad for some people, like how, you know, what's their life going to be like when they leave? But no, I guess we were all about business as usual. You know, just get them up, get them walking. So, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Had another question.
Yeah.
You know, most people don't have much experience with others who've lost limbs, and so it can be kind of awkward when you meet somebody like that. Do you have any advice on what to say, how to act? Do you just do you acknowledge the injury?
Oh, I would ask them how big the shark was. So I mean, I don't know, and we always dealt with it with humor, but you know, I think, you know, again, I worked in an Army facility where you just made fun of people left and right, and they made fun of you too. So, but yeah, I think that people hate to be pitied. It's just my opinion, but I'm not an amputee, so. But I wouldn't not acknowledge it. you know. So, but yeah, I think the shark is always good.
Okay, we got time for one more question.
Yeah.
So you work with a pretty specific demographic, which was, military. Oh, sorry. I'm not really a mic kind of guy. So you worked with a really specific demographic, which is, generally speaking, probably younger, more active because they were serving in the military. Did you find that to be a blessing or a curse, generally, from a rehab standpoint?
That's a good question. It was both. Because,
That's what I figured.
yeah, because they were younger. I mean, they didn't want to come to PT. They had just been up all night playing Xbox. They weren't going to roll on in and have me give them a hard time. But they were also extremely fit, so we could really, work them. And some patients really use that to their advantage. They would be in the clinic 6 hours a day working out. I mean, they were incredible. And so in a way, it was a blessing. And now I work with older patients, and I tell you, I think I went in there and just hammered some people, like, So it was kind of bad. So, but yeah, it's we were lucky because we were getting young people they were in excellent shape, so they could really do the work. And they invented stuff that we never had seen before. Like the makers of the sea leg told us that you couldn't go up the stairs 1 foot over the other with the sea leg, but our patients figured out how to do it by like kicking the step and sort of throwing their leg up there. I mean, and they said you can't run on the sea leg. Well, I had a patient who ran on the sea leg. There were all sorts of myths. Like one of my professors in PT school told me, you'll never see a bilateral above knee amputee walking, especially if they're not holding on to something. And well, we saw that all the time at Walter Reed. In fact, that was a goal, and it wasn't just a goal to walk, but to get them back running. So, the patients really pushed the envelope, and we just sort of try to keep up with them. So,
Thank you.
yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Great.